The cellar door appeared 3 days after the funeral, half buried in mud where the spring runoff had carved away decades of Montana mountainside. Elena Hartwell stood at the edge of the erosion, boots sinking into soft earth, staring at weathered timber and iron hinges that had no right to exist on land she thought she knew by heart. The wind carried the scent of wet pine and something else, something older, like stones that had been holding secrets too long. Her grandmother's farm stretched behind her in all directions, 200 acres of stubborn soil and fading dreams, and now this impossible door reaching up from the ground like a confession she wasn't ready to hear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Elena had inherited the property exactly 1 week ago, though inheritance felt like the wrong word for what had actually happened. Her grandmother, Margaret Hartwell, had been found in the north pasture on a Tuesday morning, clutching a rusted key in her left hand in a photograph Elena had never seen before. The official cause was heart failure, which was true enough, but it didn't explain the look on Margaret's face when they found her, peaceful and terrified all at once, like someone who had finally decided to stop running. The funeral had been small, just Elena and a handful of weathered neighbors who spoke in careful silences about a woman they claimed to have known but whose eyes always suggested otherwise. Margaret Hartwell had moved to this remote corner of the Bitterroot Mountains 40 years ago, buying the struggling farm with cash no one could explain, living alone except for the summers when young Elena would visit and learn to love the land more than the grandmother who worked it. The farm had been Elena's refuge during those childhood summers, an escape from parents whose marriage dissolved in slow motion across expensive therapy sessions and lawyers' offices in Seattle. Here, among the struggling apple orchards and fields that fought against the altitude, she had learned that some things survived simply because they refused to quit. Her grandmother had taught her to read the soil, to understand the language of weather and root systems, to recognize that farming this high in the mountains wasn't about abundance, it was about endurance. But Margaret had also taught her other things, stranger lessons that Elena had tucked away as the eccentricities of a woman who lived too far from town and too close to her own thoughts. How to walk the property lines at dawn, tracing patterns that seemed random but which Margaret insisted were essential. How to listen to the land itself, the way it spoke through the movement of animals and the growth of particular plants in particular places. How to keep certain things private, certain observations unshared, because some knowledge was dangerous in the wrong hands. Now at 32, Elena had walked away from a career in agricultural consulting in Denver, packing her life into a truck and driving north to claim a legacy she wasn't sure she wanted. The farm was failing, had been failing for years according to the documents Margaret's lawyer had presented with apologetic efficiency. The orchards produced enough apples to sustain one person, maybe, and the small herd of heritage cattle her grandmother had maintained were more expensive than profitable. The bank held a lien on the property, payments 3 months overdue, and the water rights situation was complicated by disputes Elena didn't yet understand with neighboring properties. The lawyer had been clear, she could sell, probably should sell, take what equity remained and return to the life she had built elsewhere. But standing at Margaret's graveside, watching them lower a woman who had never explained herself into mountain soil, Elena had felt something shift inside her. The farm wasn't just land and debt. It was the last unanswered question of her grandmother's life, and Elena had never been good at leaving puzzles unsolved. The discovery of the cellar door changed everything, or maybe it just revealed what had been true all along. Elena had been inspecting the erosion damage from the unusual spring storms, worried about losing more of the already limited pasture, when her boot had struck something solid where there should have been only mud and rock. 20 minutes of digging with the shovel from her truck had exposed enough of the structure to steal her breath. The door was massive, constructed from timber that looked hand-hewn and treated with something that had preserved it far beyond what weather should have allowed. The iron hardware wasn't just old, it was custom-forged, featuring a design she had never seen before, an intricate symbol that seemed to shift when she looked at it from different angles, like an optical illusion carved into metal. But it was the lock that made her hands shake, because it was new, or relatively new, installed maybe 30 or 40 years ago, and it matched perfectly with the rusted key they had found in Margaret's hand. She had called no one, told no one, driven back to the farmhouse in twilight that painted the mountains the color of old bruises, and sat at her grandmother's kitchen table trying to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. The practical choice was obvious. Document the find, call the historical society, let professionals handle whatever lay beneath that door. But there was the key in her pocket, heavy and purposeful, and there was the photograph they had found with Margaret, faded and creased but clear enough to show a much younger version of her grandmother standing with two other women in front of a building Elena didn't recognize. On the back, in handwriting she knew was Margaret's, 3 words, "The Keeper's Burden." The farmhouse held its own secrets that week, revealing themselves to Elena as she moved through rooms her grandmother had occupied alone for 4 decades. In the attic, she found boxes of documents that made no sense, shipping manifests from the 1940s listing agricultural products in quantities the farm had never produced, correspondence with universities about soil studies that had apparently never been published, receipts for equipment Elena had never seen on the property. There were journals too, dozens of them, but they were written in a code or shorthand Elena couldn't decipher, pages filled with symbols and notations that might have been agricultural observations or might have been something else entirely. And there were photographs, so many photographs, showing Margaret at different ages, always with the same 2 women from the funeral picture, always standing near farm buildings or in fields, always with expressions that suggested they were guarding something rather than simply living. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning Elena finally decided to open the cellar, she woke to find one of the heritage cows standing at the erosion site, something the animals had never done before. The old Hereford, a cow Margaret had called Duchess and had refused to sell despite multiple good offers, stood perfectly still, staring at the partially exposed door with an intensity that seemed impossible for livestock. When Elena approached, the cow didn't startle or move, just turned her head slowly and made eye contact in a way that raised the hair on Elena's arms. She had worked with cattle before, knew they were smarter than most people credited, but this felt different. This felt like recognition, like the animal was waiting for something and had decided Elena was finally ready to provide it. The key fit perfectly, turning in the lock with a resistance that suggested decades of disuse followed by a click that echoed with finality. Elena had brought a flashlight, work gloves, her phone fully charged for photographs and emergency calls, but she had told no one where she was going or what she was doing. This was probably stupid, the kind of decision that ended with injuries and regrets, but something deeper than logic was driving her now. She needed to understand what her grandmother had been protecting, needed to know why a woman who had raised chickens and grown apples and lived with such deliberate simplicity had died clutching a key to something she had never mentioned. The door was heavy, requiring her full weight to pull it open, hinges groaning with a sound that seemed to travel through the ground itself. Cool air rushed out, carrying scents that made Elena's agricultural training kick in immediately. Cedar and mineral salts, copper and something organic she couldn't quite place. The darkness beyond the door was absolute, swallowing her flashlight beam for the first few feet before revealing stone steps descending into the mountain. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each step carved and fitted with precision that spoke of serious engineering, not the rough excavation she might have expected from a farm cellar. The walls showed tool marks, but they were deliberate, almost decorative, creating patterns that echoed the symbol from the door's hardware. Elena descended slowly, counting steps, her mind automatically calculating depth and volume. 20 steps, roughly 15 feet down, opening into a chamber that made her stop breathing. The cellar was massive, extending back into the hillside at least 60 feet, the ceiling supported by timber beams that showed the same careful preservation as the door. But it wasn't the size that shocked her. It was the contents. Shelves lined the walls, floor to ceiling, and they were filled not with the expected root vegetables or canned goods, but with something that looked like a library designed by someone who understood both farming and something else entirely. There were jars, hundreds of them, but they didn't contain food. Each one held soil, labeled with dates and locations that spanned decades and crossed state lines. There were seed collections organized with scientific precision, each variety documented with notes about growth patterns, resilience, and something Margaret had called harmonic resonance. There were tools, some Elena recognized and some that looked like agricultural implements redesigned by someone with different priorities, different understanding of how plants and soil actually worked. And there were books, actual bound volumes with handwritten pages, filled with observations and experiments that suggested her grandmother hadn't been a simple farmer at all. But it was the back wall that made Elena sink onto one of the wooden crates scattered through the space, legs suddenly unreliable. Mounted there, protected behind glass that looked far newer than the cellar itself, were 3 large photographs. The same 3 women from the funeral picture, but younger, standing in different locations that Elena slowly recognized as other farms, other properties scattered across the mountain west. And beneath the photographs, a plaque with words that seemed to glow in her flashlight beam: "The Keepers of the Old Ways, established 1943, guardians of what grows in secret." Elena's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from James Reiner, the neighbor whose property bordered hers to the east, a man in his 70s who had known Margaret and who had been carefully kind at the funeral. The message was short: "Saw lights. Are you in the north pasture? We need to talk about what you found." Her heart hammered as she stared at the message. How could he possibly know? She had told no one, had been careful to approach the erosion site from angles that couldn't be seen from neighboring properties. But as she looked around the cellar again, really looked, she noticed other details. Fresh footprints in the dust that weren't hers, recent ones. A battery-powered lantern sitting on one of the shelves, modern and clearly maintained. A notebook lying open on a small desk in the corner, with entries dated from just 2 months ago, in Margaret's handwriting. Her grandmother hadn't been alone in this. And whoever else knew about the cellar, they knew Elena had finally opened it. The phone buzzed again. "James, don't touch anything else. I'm coming to you. There are things Margaret should have told you before she died, but she ran out of time. We all did." Elena stood, flashlight beams sweeping across the impossible collection surrounding her, mind racing through implications she wasn't ready to accept. This wasn't just a cellar. It was an archive, a laboratory, a sanctuary for something her grandmother had dedicated her life to protecting. And the farm that Elena had thought was dying, that everyone had assumed was just another failed mountain homestead, was apparently something else entirely. Outside, Duchess was still standing guard, and Elena could hear the sound of a truck approaching on the access road, James coming to explain secrets that Margaret had taken to her grave. The cellar door stood open behind her, cool air still flowing from darkness that held 40 years of hidden work, and Elena realized that inheriting the farm hadn't been about land or legacy at all. It had been about joining something that predated her grandmother, something that required protection and understanding, and a commitment Elena hadn't known she was making when she decided to stay. The spring runoff had exposed more than a forgotten cellar. It had revealed a responsibility that had been waiting for her since those childhood summers when Margaret had taught her to read the soil and listen to the land. And now, standing between the mountain that held these secrets and the neighbor who was coming to explain them, Elena understood that the real inheritance wasn't the farm at all. It was the choice of what to do with the truth that grew in its hidden places, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it up and strong enough to carry it forward. James Reiner's truck rolled to a stop beside the erosion site with the careful precision of a man who had driven these mountain roads for 70 years and knew exactly where the ground could be trusted. He climbed out slowly, favoring his left knee, and stood there in the weak morning light looking at Elena with an expression that mixed relief and something darker, something like dread. He didn't ask if she had opened the cellar. He could see it in her face, in the way she was standing with her shoulders squared like someone bracing for impact. "Margaret was supposed to have another 5 years," he said finally, his voice carrying the gravel of age and regret. "That was the timeline we agreed on. 5 more years to prepare you properly, to ease you into understanding what this place really is." He gestured at the open cellar door, at Duchess still standing watch, at the farm spread across the mountainside behind them. "But the land doesn't care about our timelines. Never has." Elena's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. "You've known about this cellar all along. You've been down there. It wasn't a question. Known about it?" James let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Elena, I helped build it. Me and Margaret and Caroline Voss, back in 1973, though the network it connects to goes back a hell of a lot further than that. He moved toward the cellar entrance, gestures for her to follow. We need to talk inside. There are ears out here that you haven't learned to recognize yet. Inside the cellar, James moved with familiar ease, lighting the battery-powered lantern's position throughout the space, revealing details Elena had missed in her initial shock. The shelves weren't just storage, they were organized according to a system that became clear as James explained it, each section corresponding to a different aspect of what he called the old agricultural sciences. The soil samples weren't random collections but careful documentation of earth from sites across the western mountains, places where traditional farming knowledge claimed the ground held special properties, places where crops grew despite impossible conditions or where livestock thrived on land that should have broken them. Your grandmother wasn't just a farmer, James said, running his weathered hand along one of the shelves. She was a keeper. One of the last true keepers of agricultural knowledge that predates modern science by centuries, maybe millennia. He pulled down one of the hand-bound books, opened it to a page filled with diagrams Elena now recognized as planting charts that incorporated lunar cycles, magnetic field variations, and soil mineral compositions in ways her agricultural degree had never mentioned. This isn't mysticism or superstition. This is empirical observation refined over generations by people who understood that the land is alive in ways we've forgotten how to perceive. Elena's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the grandmother she had known, practical and reserved, with this picture of a woman maintaining ancient agricultural secrets in a hidden mountain cellar. Why hide it? If this knowledge is real, if it works, why keep it buried? James's expression hardened. Because real knowledge is dangerous, girl. Dangerous to power structures that depend on people remaining disconnected from the land. Dangerous to industries built on chemical dependencies and engineered seeds. Dangerous to governments that want food production centralized and controllable. He gestured at the carefully preserved seeds, the documented soil compositions, the decades of observation notes. What's in this cellar could revolutionize farming, could help people grow food in places currently considered barren, could break corporate control over agriculture. You think that kind of threat goes unpunished? Before Elena could respond, the sound of another vehicle approaching made James's face go pale. Damn it. They're faster than I thought they'd be. He moved to the cellar entrance, tension in every line of his body. Elena, listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you need to understand that this farm, this cellar, the knowledge your grandmother protected, it's all connected to something much bigger than you know. And there are people who have been waiting a very long time for Margaret to die so they could claim it. The vehicle that pulled up was a black SUV with government plates, followed by a second car, a silver sedan that Elena recognized from town, belonging to Marcus Chen, a representative from the county land management office who had called twice since the funeral about scheduling a property assessment. Two men in dark suits emerged from the SUV, their bearing and the way they scanned the property screaming federal agents, while Marcus climbed out of the sedan looking uncomfortable and apologetic. The older of the two agents, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that assessed everything with bureaucratic precision, approached the cellar entrance. Ms. Hartwell, I'm Agent David Morrison with the Department of Agriculture's Historical Preservation Division. We received reports of unusual structural discoveries on this property and we're here to secure the site for official evaluation. James stepped forward, positioning himself between the agents and Elena. Morrison. Still doing their dirty work after all these years. There was history in his voice, old conflict that had never fully healed. Morrison's expression didn't change. Mr. Reiner. I was hoping you'd have the good sense to stay out of this. Margaret's death changes the protection status of this site. The agreements she made, the autonomy she was granted, those died with her. This property is now subject to federal agricultural heritage laws, and anything found here falls under governmental jurisdiction. Governmental jurisdiction? Elena found her voice, anger cutting through confusion. This is private property. My property. You can't just claim jurisdiction because you found out about a cellar. Actually, we can. Morrison pulled out a folder, handed it to her with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. These are the relevant statutes regarding agricultural sites of historical significance. Your grandmother was granted special exemptions during her lifetime due to her cooperation with our research programs, but those exemptions were non-transferable. Any structures or materials found on this property that predate 1950 are subject to immediate federal preservation protocols. Elena scanned the documents, her consulting background helping her parse the legal language even as fury built in her chest. The laws were real, broadly written and vaguely enforced, the kind of regulations that could be weaponized by agencies with agendas. But there was something else in the folder, transfer documents showing that the bank holding the lien on her farm had sold that debt to a federal agricultural trust 3 days ago. They didn't just want access to the cellar. They wanted the entire property. "You can't do this," she said, but even as the words left her mouth she knew they could. The debt, the strategic timing right after Margaret's death, the legal framework they were invoking, it was a coordinated seizure dressed up as historical preservation. James's voice was quiet but fierce. Margaret fought them for 40 years. Kept this place independent, kept the knowledge free and accessible to those who needed it. She knew they'd come for it eventually, but she believed if she could just hold on long enough, find the right successor, someone with the understanding and the spine to continue the work. He looked at Elena with something like hope struggling against despair. "She chose you for a reason." Morrison gestured to his partner, who began moving toward the cellar entrance. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hartwell, but we need to secure this site immediately. You'll be compensated fairly for the property's agricultural value and relocated with full assistance. This doesn't have to be adversarial." "Like hell it doesn't." The voice came from behind them, and Elena turned to see Caroline Voss climbing out of a battered farm truck, moving with the careful determination of a woman in her 80s who had decided that age was no longer going to slow her down. Elena recognized her from the photographs, one of the 3 women, one of the keepers. "Morrison, you vulture. Couldn't even wait until Margaret was cold in the ground before you came circling." Caroline walked past the agents like they were fence posts, embraced James briefly, then turned her full attention to Elena. "Your grandmother and I worked this network for 53 years. We protected knowledge that your people," she jabbed a finger at Morrison, "have been trying to steal or suppress since the agricultural revolution started replacing wisdom with chemistry. You want this cellar? You want these seeds and soil samples and all that documented knowledge? You're going to have to drag 3 generations of keepers off this land first." Marcus Chen, who had been standing awkwardly beside his sedan, finally spoke up. "Caroline, Agent Morrison, maybe we could discuss this reasonably. There might be a compromise that preserves both the site's historical value and Ms. Hartwell's property rights." "There's no compromise with people who think knowledge should be locked in government vaults instead of shared with farmers who need it," Caroline snapped. Margaret understood that. She spent her whole life making sure this information stayed free, stayed accessible. And she left it to Elena because she knew the girl had enough of her in her to fight for it. Elena's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of everything being said. The cellar wasn't just her grandmother's secret, it was part of a network, multiple sites apparently, maintained by keepers who had dedicated their lives to preserving agricultural knowledge outside governmental and corporate control. And that knowledge was valuable enough that federal agencies were willing to use legal mechanisms to seize it. Morrison's patience was wearing thin. "Ms. Voss, this isn't 1973 anymore. The protections you and Margaret negotiated were conditional and temporary. The world has changed. Food security is a national security issue now, and information this sensitive can't be left in private hands, no matter how well-intentioned." "Food security," Caroline spat the words like they tasted rotten. "You mean corporate control. You mean patented seeds and chemical dependencies in farmers who can't save their own crops because some laboratory owns the genetic code. That's what you're really protecting, Morrison. The same interests that turned farming from a way of life into an extraction industry." The second agent had reached the cellar entrance and was starting down the steps when Duchess, who had been standing motionless throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly moved. The old cow positioned herself directly at the entrance, lowering her head in a posture that was unmistakably threatening. The agent stopped, hand moving toward his hip in an instinctive reach for a weapon he apparently carried. "I wouldn't," James said quietly. "Heritage cattle bred from lines that predate industrial agriculture, they've got instincts your feedlot animals have had bred out of them. She's protecting what she was raised to protect, and she won't move for strangers with bad intentions." Morrison's expression tightened. "We can remove one animal if necessary." "You'd have to remove all of them," Elena heard herself say, surprise in her own voice at the certainty she felt. "The entire herd, Margaret's chickens, probably the barn cats too." She didn't just keep heritage breeds because they were historical. She kept them because they were part of this, whatever this is. They're connected to the land in ways your industrial animals aren't. Caroline's face showed something that might have been pride. "Margaret taught you more than you realized, didn't she? Those summer visits, learning to read soil and watch weather, understanding that farming isn't just about production, it's about relationship. You felt it even if you didn't have words for it." Elena had felt it, had always known there was something different about her grandmother's farm, the way the struggling orchards produced fruit sweeter than commercial varieties, the way the cattle stayed healthy on rough pasture that shouldn't have sustained them, the way vegetables grew in soil that tested as marginal but yielded crops that seemed to thrive on adversity. She had attributed it to Margaret's skill and stubbornness, but standing here now, looking at the cellar full of documented knowledge in the faces of people who had spent lifetimes protecting it, she understood it was something more deliberate. "What exactly is in those jars?" she asked Caroline, gesturing at the hundreds of soil samples. What was Margaret really documenting? Caroline and James exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Then Caroline moved to one of the shelves, selected a jar labeled with coordinates that Elena recognized as somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, dated 1978. Soil from places where the old agricultural practices still work, where the land remembers how to partner with people who know how to listen to it. "We've been mapping it for decades, documenting the correlation between mineral compositions, electromagnetic properties, and what we call growth resonance. Places where crops flourish despite conditions that should make them fail, where livestock develop unusual hardiness, where the boundary between cultivation and wild growth becomes cooperative instead of adversarial." "That's pseudoscience," Morrison interrupted. "Electromagnetic properties affecting plant growth, resonance between soil and cultivation, these are fringe theories that have been repeatedly debunked by actual agricultural science. Debunked by science funded by chemical companies and industrial agriculture corporations who profit from farmers believing the soil is dead matter that needs constant intervention," Caroline shot back. "We've got 70 years of empirical observation in this cellar and 2 other sites like it. Documented, replicated, verified by farmers across the Mountain West who use this knowledge to grow food in places your experts say are impossible. You want to debunk it? Try growing anything using your methods at 12,000 feet in soil that's mostly rock. Then come back and tell me our pseudoscience doesn't work." Morrison pulled out his phone, made a brief call, and within minutes Elena could hear more vehicles approaching. They were bringing reinforcements, preparing to secure the site by force if necessary. The situation was escalating beyond conversation into something that felt like a siege. Marcus Chin moved closer to Elena, voice low. "I'm supposed to be here representing the county's interests, but I need you to know something. 3 other properties in this region have been seized under similar pretexts in the last 5 years. Small farms with unique agricultural practices, soil that tested unusual, livestock breeds that didn't match modern genetics. They're all gone now, the families relocated, the land transferred to federal agricultural research facilities that never published their findings." He glanced at Morrison, made sure the agent wasn't listening. "Your grandmother fought them off, but she had connections and leverage you don't have. If you want to keep this place, you're going to need a different strategy." Elena looked at the cellar entrance, at Duchess still standing guard, at James and Caroline who represented generations of resistance against exactly this kind of theft. She thought about her grandmother dying with a key in her hand, about the farm that had been her refuge in mystery, about knowledge that could help people but which powerful interests wanted controlled or buried. The practical part of her mind, the part that had built a career in agricultural consulting by being realistic about economics and politics, told her to accept the compensation, walk away, find another life somewhere else. But standing there on land that had been asking her questions since childhood, surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's lifelong defiance, she felt something else rising in her. Stubbornness maybe, or legacy, or simply the recognition that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. "No," she said, loud enough for Morrison to hear. "You're not taking this farm. You're not seizing this cellar. And you're definitely not locking up knowledge that belongs to farmers, not bureaucrats." Morrison's expression shifted to something harder. "Miss Hartwell, I strongly advise you to reconsider. We have the legal authority, the resources, and the mandate to secure this site. Resistance will only make the process more difficult for everyone involved." "Then I guess it's going to be difficult," Elena replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Because my grandmother spent 40 years protecting this place, and I'll be damned if I let you take it 3 days after we buried her." The additional vehicles were pulling up now, more agents, official-looking people with equipment for documentation and seizure. But Elena noticed something else: trucks with local plates, neighbors she recognized from the funeral, people who had known Margaret and who were now gathering at the property line, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. James had made calls apparently, mobilizing whatever network of support still existed in these mountains. Caroline put a weathered hand on Elena's shoulder. "Welcome to the family business, girl. It's never been easy, and it's about to get a whole lot harder. But you've got your grandmother's backbone, I can see it. And you've got us, for whatever that's worth anymore." Morrison was coordinating with his team, preparing to move forward despite Elena's objection, when Marcus Chin did something unexpected. He stepped between the agents in the cellar entrance, pulled out his county credentials, and spoke with an authority Elena hadn't heard from him before. "Agent Morrison, I need to inform you that as county land management representative, I'm placing a hold on any federal action on this property pending a full county review of the historical preservation claims and their applicability to sites with active agricultural operations. You want to proceed, you'll need to get clearance through the county commissioners, and I can guarantee you that's going to take time." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "You don't have the authority to interfere with federal operations." "Actually, I do," Marcus replied, pulling out more documents. County oversight of federal land actions was established in the Watershed Protection Agreements of 1992. This property sits in a designated watershed area, which means any changes to its use or ownership require county environmental review. Check your files, Agent Morrison. Your lawyers will confirm it. The standoff had shifted, the clear path to seizure now complicated by jurisdictional questions and local resistance. Morrison knew it. Elena could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the cost of pushing forward against the political complications of a drawn-out fight with local government and community opposition. But it was what Caroline said next that changed everything. "You can keep trying to take sites one at a time, Morrison, fight these jurisdictional battles, tie up courts and counties for years. Or you could accept what Margaret knew and what we've been trying to tell people like you for decades. This knowledge doesn't threaten food security, it enhances it. Let us share it properly, work with farmers who need it, build networks that strengthen agricultural resilience instead of corporate dependence. Stop treating traditional agricultural wisdom like it's a weapon to be controlled and start treating it like the resource it actually is." Morrison didn't respond immediately, but Elena saw something shift in his expression, some recognition that the approach had been failing, that seizure and suppression hadn't actually protected anything, just created more resistance and pushed the knowledge further underground. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning fog, revealing the farm spread across the mountainside in all its stubborn persistence. Elena looked at the land her grandmother had defended, the cellar full of secrets that were really just forgotten wisdom, the gathering of neighbors and keepers who represented something older than modern agriculture's industrial certainty. And she understood finally what Margaret had been trying to teach her during all those childhood summers. The land didn't need saving. It needed partnership, needed people willing to listen and learn and fight for the relationship between soil and cultivation that industrial thinking had tried to sever. the inheritance wasn't the farm. It was the responsibility to maintain that relationship, to protect the knowledge that made it possible, and to pass it forward to whoever came next. Morrison made his decision. "We're not done here, Ms. Hartwell. But we're leaving for now. This conversation isn't over." He signaled his team to withdraw, got back in his SUV, and drove away with the kind of controlled fury that promised future conflict. As the government vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Elena felt James and Caroline beside her, felt the weight of what she had just committed to settling across her shoulders like her grandmother's old work coat. The cellar stood open behind them, full of knowledge and questions. The farm stretched ahead, 200 acres of possibility and burden. And somewhere in the soil, Margaret's voice seemed to whisper that this was only the beginning. The week following Morrison's retreat felt like walking through a house after a storm had passed, checking for damage, discovering what remained standing and what had been quietly broken. Elena spent her days in the cellar, reading through her grandmother's documentation with Caroline and James as guides, learning a language of agriculture that her degree had never taught her. The soil samples weren't just collections, they were maps of living systems, each jar representing a place where the boundary between human cultivation and natural growth had achieved something her textbooks would have called impossible. The seed collections told stories of adaptation and resilience, varieties that had survived by partnering with soil instead of dominating it, that had learned to thrive in conditions industrial agriculture had written off as unworkable. Caroline sat beside her one afternoon, pointing to entries in one of Margaret's journals, handwriting that grew shakier in recent years but never less precise. "Your grandmother understood something most modern farmers have forgotten," she said, her weathered finger tracing lines of observation about lunar planting cycles and soil mineral fluctuations. "The land isn't a factory floor where you input chemicals and extract crops. It's a living partner that responds to attention and intention." These records document 70 years of conversation between three women and the mountains that taught them how to listen. James brought news from the network, other keepers across the mountain west who had heard about the confrontation and were watching to see what Elena would do next. Some were fearful, worried that drawing federal attention would bring agents to their own properties. Others were hopeful, believing that maybe the time for hiding this knowledge had passed, that a new generation might find ways to share it that the old guard had been too cautious to attempt. The network was fracturing along generational lines, between those who had spent lifetimes protecting secrets and those who wondered what good protection was if the wisdom died with its keepers. Elena discovered that her grandmother had been writing to her, letters never sent, tucked into one of the journals and dated across the last 5 years. They spoke of legacy and burden, of the loneliness of being a keeper, of watching the world change in ways that made the old knowledge seem increasingly necessary and increasingly impossible to preserve. Margaret had known her health was failing, had known she was running out of time to prepare Elena properly, and the regret in those pages was sharp enough to cut. "I see you in the soil samples you collected as a child," one letter read, the handwriting from 3 years ago still steady and strong. "Remember that summer when you were 12 and you insisted on mapping where the wild strawberries grew thickest? You didn't know you were documenting nutrient flows and mycorrhizal networks. You just knew the land was trying to tell you something and you wanted to understand its language. That's the gift I hoped you'd keep, even when the world taught you to stop listening. That's why this farm has to be yours. Not because you're family, though you are. But because you've always been willing to hear what the ground is saying." The financial reality of keeping the farm was brutal in ways that agricultural poetry couldn't soften. The bank debt that had been sold to the federal trust was still debt, payments still due, and Marcus Chen's jurisdictional hold had only delayed seizure, not prevented it. Elena spent evenings at Margaret's kitchen table, running numbers that refused to balance, looking for solutions that the spreadsheets wouldn't provide. The heritage cattle were valuable to the right buyers, but selling them felt like dismantling the very system she was trying to protect. The apple orchards could be expanded, maybe, certified organic and marketed to the restaurants and specialty stores that paid premium prices, but that required capital she didn't have and time the bank wouldn't grant. It was during one of these late-night accounting sessions that Elena noticed something odd in Margaret's financial records from the past decade. Regular deposits, small amounts from multiple sources, annotated with names she didn't recognize in locations scattered across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. When she asked Caroline about it, the older woman's face softened with something like pride. "The network doesn't just share knowledge," Caroline explained. "We support each other." Farmers who use the methods Margaret documented, who've seen their yields improve and their soil health strengthen, they contribute what they can to keep the keeper sites operational. It's not charity, it's investment in their own agricultural future. Margaret never advertised it, never asked directly, but the people who benefit from this work understand its value. The deposits weren't large enough to save the farm alone, but they represented something Elena's consulting background had taught her to recognize: proof of concept, evidence that what the cellar contained had real-world economic value beyond the theoretical. People were willing to pay for access to knowledge that helped them farm more successfully. The question was whether that value could be formalized, structured into something sustainable without compromising the accessibility that made it worth protecting. Marcus Chin proved unexpectedly useful in navigating this question. He visited the farm regularly, ostensibly to monitor the jurisdictional hold, but actually to help Elena understand the legal frameworks that might allow her to operate the keeper site as something between a research station and an educational farm. There were grants available for heritage agriculture, tax benefits for properties that maintained genetic diversity in livestock and seeds, conservation easements that could provide income while protecting the land from development. None of it was simple, all of it required paperwork that made Elena's head ache, but slowly a picture emerged of how the farm might survive financially while maintaining its essential purpose. "Your grandmother was brilliant at agriculture," Marcus said one evening, helping Elena fill out yet another grant application. "But she was stubborn about keeping everything informal, person to person, resistant to any structure that might be documented or regulated. That protected the knowledge, but it also made the operation vulnerable. You've got a chance to build something more resilient, something that can survive transitions of leadership and changes in political climate. But it means accepting some visibility, some official recognition of what you're doing here." The idea terrified her. Visibility was what had brought Morrison and his agents. Official recognition meant oversight, regulation, the possibility of the very control they were trying to avoid. But isolation had its own costs, as Margaret's sudden death had proven. The knowledge protected in darkness was knowledge that could be lost when its keepers died. There had to be a middle path, some way to share the wisdom without surrendering it to institutional control. The answer came from an unexpected source. Elena had been experimenting with the Cellar's seed collection, planting trials in one of the smaller pastures using Margaret's documented methods. The results were preliminary but striking: vegetables growing in soil that standard testing said was too rocky and acidic, yields that shouldn't have been possible given the altitude and short growing season. She documented everything with the same precision her grandmother had taught her, photographing growth stages, recording soil conditions, noting weather patterns and lunar phases. On impulse, she started a blog, nothing fancy, just photographs and observations about traditional agricultural methods being tested on a small mountain farm. She didn't mention the Cellar or the network, didn't reference the confrontation with federal agents, just shared the practical reality of what happened when you treated soil like a living partner instead of an inert medium. The response surprised her. Farmers from across the country started following, asking questions, sharing their own observations, creating a conversation that felt organic and genuine. Caroline was skeptical at first. "The internet isn't secure," she warned. "Everything you post can be monitored, used against you." But as the community grew, as farmers started reporting successful experiments with methods Elena had documented, the older woman's resistance softened. "Maybe this is how it has to evolve," she admitted. "Margaret and we kept everything close because we lived through times when this knowledge got you labeled a communist or a lunatic. But the world's different now. People are hungry for alternatives to industrial agriculture, desperate for methods that don't require them to mortgage everything to chemical companies. Maybe visibility is the protection now, not secrecy." James was more immediately enthusiastic. He started contributing his own observations to the blog, decades of experience with heritage livestock and traditional breeding methods. Other keepers from the network began reaching out, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, sharing their own documented wisdom. What had been isolated cells of preserved knowledge started connecting, forming a web of shared learning that was harder to suppress than individual sites had been. The blog caught the attention of a documentary filmmaker from Portland who wanted to feature the farm in a series about agricultural resilience. Elena was inclined to refuse until she realized that the visibility might be exactly what she needed to protect the property. Morrison and his agency operated best in shadows, pressuring isolated farmers with seizure threats that never made headlines. But if the farm became publicly known, if its methods were being watched and replicated by thousands of people, seizure would be politically complicated in ways the federal government might not want to risk. She agreed to the documentary on the condition that the cellar itself remained private, that the focus stayed on the practical application of methods rather than the historical archive. The filmmaker accepted, and over 3 weeks of shooting, Elena found herself articulating principles her grandmother had demonstrated but never fully explained. The land as partner rather than resource. Cultivation as conversation. Agriculture as relationship requiring patience and attention and willingness to learn from failure. The rhetoric felt almost spiritual, which made her uncomfortable, but the farmers watching responded to it because they recognized the truth beneath the poetry. The documentary premiered 6 months after Elena had opened the cellar door, screened at agricultural film festivals and sustainability conferences, watched by farmers and students and policymakers trying to understand alternatives to industrial food production. The farm's blog traffic increased dramatically. Requests for site visits and educational workshops flooded her email. Publishers contacted her about writing a book documenting traditional agricultural methods for modern application. It was overwhelming and exhausting and nothing like what Elena had imagined when she inherited a struggling mountain farm. But it was also working. The combination of grant funding, workshop fees, sales of heritage seeds and consulting services created an income stream that stabilized the farm's finances. She was able to hire 2 young farmers interested in learning keeper methods, college graduates disillusioned with industrial agriculture who were hungry for different approaches. The operation expanded carefully, maintaining the essential mission while adapting to a world that was finally ready to listen. Morrison never came back, but Elena knew he was watching. The Federal Agricultural Trust quietly sold the farm's debt back to a regional bank, probably recognizing that attempting seizure of a property with public visibility and documentary evidence of successful alternative methods would create more problems than it solved. The jurisdictional questions remained unresolved, leaving a legal sword hanging over the property, but the immediate threat had receded into bureaucratic limbo. Caroline's health began failing that winter, the cold settling into her lungs with a persistence that worried everyone who knew her. She spent her final weeks at the farm, insisting she wanted to see spring planting one more time, wanted to witness what Margaret's legacy was becoming. Elena sat with her in the cellar one afternoon, both of them wrapped in blankets against the underground chill, surrounded by jars of soil and seeds and 70 years of documented wisdom. Margaret would have hated all this visibility, Caroline said, her voice raspy but amused. She'd have been furious about the blog and the documentary and strangers tramping through her pastures learning methods she thought should be passed down personally, teacher to student, hand to hand. The old woman reached out, gripped Elena's hand with surprising strength. But she'd have been proud too. Proud that you found a way to protect the knowledge by sharing it, that you understood the difference between preserving wisdom and burying it. Caroline died on the spring equinox, passing quietly in her sleep in the farmhouse guest room with the window open to let in the sound of snowmelt running through the irrigation channels. They buried her next to Margaret in the small cemetery that overlooked the valley, 2 keepers finally resting in soil they had spent lifetimes understanding. The funeral drew people from across the mountain west, farmers whose operations had been strengthened by methods these women had preserved, younger keepers who represented the network's future, and a surprising number of agricultural researchers who had quietly been following Elena's work with professional fascination. James spoke at the service, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the authority of 70 years lived close to the land. Caroline and Margaret, they were the last of something old, he said. The last keepers who remembered a time before industrial agriculture convinced everyone that farming was supposed to be simple, that you could reduce growing food to inputs and outputs and chemical formulas. They knew it was never that simple, that the land keeps its own counsel and teaches its lessons slowly to anyone willing to listen long enough. He paused, looked directly at Elena. But they were also the first of something new, the first to understand that this knowledge couldn't survive in isolation, that protection without transmission is just slower death. What Elena is building here, what all of you are learning to carry forward, that's the future they worked for even when they didn't fully believe it could exist. After the service, Elena walked the property alone, following the same paths her grandmother had traced every morning, reading the land with eyes that had been trained by documentation and experience and love. The orchards were beginning to bud, the heritage cattle grazed in patterns that respected the soil's recovery needs, and the experimental plots showed early growth that confirmed another season of successful traditional methods. The farm wasn't struggling anymore. It was thriving in exactly the way Margaret had always insisted was possible when cultivation partnered with landscape instead of dominating it. In the cellar that evening, Elena added her own journal to the collection, documenting the year's observations, the lessons learned, the methods refined through practice and failure. She wrote about the farmers who had visited, the questions they had asked, the experiments they were conducting on their own properties. She documented the network's evolution from hidden cells of preserved knowledge to a growing movement of agricultural practitioners willing to challenge industrial certainty with empirical observation and traditional wisdom. And she wrote about her grandmother, about the woman she had known and the keeper she had been, about legacy measured not in acres or dollars but in soil health and seed diversity and the patient transmission of understanding from one generation to the next. The inheritance hadn't been the farm after all, or the cellar, or even the documented knowledge. It had been the relationship with land that made all of it meaningful, the willingness to listen when the ground spoke, to learn from failure, to trust that partnership with natural systems was more resilient than control of them. Outside, the mountain night settled across the valley with the weight of ancient stone and patient soil. The farm lights glowed warm against the darkness, marking human presence in landscape that had been teaching agricultural lessons for millennia to anyone stubborn enough to pay attention. Elena sat in her grandmother's cellar, surrounded by jars of earth and seeds of persistence, adding her voice to a conversation that stretched back generations and forward into futures she would help shape but never fully see. The land had asked her questions since childhood, whispered in the language of growth and season and the patient alchemy of cultivation. Now, finally, she understood that the answers weren't meant to be possessed or protected or hidden. They were meant to be lived, practiced, shared with anyone willing to learn that the ground beneath their feet was alive and listening, ready to teach those who approached it with humility and attention and love. The cellar door stood open to spring air that smelled of snowmelt and awakening earth. Somewhere in the darkness, seeds were remembering how to grow. And Elena, keeper of knowledge and teller of stories, guardian of her grandmother's defiant legacy, sat writing the next chapter in a conversation between human hands and living soil that would continue long after she, too, returned to the mountain that had taught her everything worth knowing. 3 years after Caroline's funeral, Elena stood at the edge of the north pasture watching the first workshop participants of the season arrive, their vehicles winding up the mountain road in the soft light of early June. The farm had changed in ways both visible and subtle since that morning she had discovered the cellar door. The orchards had been expanded, heritage apple varieties now thriving on terraces that James had helped her design using principles documented in Margaret's journals. The experimental plots had become demonstration gardens, showcasing traditional planting methods that participants would spend the next week learning to adapt to their own properties. The old barn had been converted into a teaching space, its walls lined with photographs and documentation that told the story of agricultural wisdom preserved across generations. But the deepest changes weren't visible in structures or plantings. They lived in the soil itself, in measurements that confirmed what Margaret had always claimed, that land treated as partner rather than resource responded with abundance that chemistry alone couldn't explain. The university researchers who had initially approached Elena's work with academic skepticism were now regular visitors, quietly conducting studies that confirmed nutrient cycling and soil biology improvements that traditional methods somehow amplified. They didn't have explanations yet that satisfied conventional agricultural science, but the empirical evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. Elena watched a young woman climb out of a truck with Nebraska plates, recognized the cautious hope in her posture. She had read that expression on dozens of faces over the past 3 years, farmers coming to the mountains seeking alternatives to methods that had left them drowning in debt and degraded soil. Some arrived defensive, needing to prove that their struggles weren't personal failures but systemic problems requiring different approaches. Others came humble and desperate, willing to try anything that might help them continue farming without surrendering to corporate seed contracts and chemical dependencies. All of them left changed in ways that went beyond technique, carrying home an understanding that agriculture could be practiced as relationship rather than extraction. The network that Caroline and Margaret had protected in secrecy now existed in partial daylight, still cautious but no longer hidden. Keeper sites across the Mountain West had begun offering similar workshops, sharing methods through regional gatherings and online forums that connected traditional knowledge with farmers hungry for alternatives. It wasn't perfect, wasn't safe from those who still saw agricultural wisdom as commodity to be controlled, but it was alive and growing in ways that underground preservation never could have achieved. James had largely retired from active farming, his niece finally insisting on rest after 75 years of mountain labor, but he came to every workshop to share stories that gave context to the methods being taught. The participants loved him, this weathered keeper who spoke about soil with the reverence others reserved for religion, who could describe crop rotations and companion plantings with poetry that made ancient practices feel relevant to modern struggles. Elena had transcribed many of his talks, creating audio recordings that would preserve his voice and wisdom for whoever came next. The farmhouse held ghosts now, but they were the generous kind that offered guidance rather than haunting. Elena still found Margaret's handwriting in unexpected places, notes tucked into seed packets or scrawled in the margins of old almanacs, small pieces of her grandmother's thinking preserved in the objects she had handled daily. The letters Margaret had written but never sent, Elena had finally read them all, understanding now what her grandmother had been trying to say about legacy and burden, about the loneliness of protection and the risk of transmission. Margaret had feared that sharing the knowledge would corrupt it, that making it accessible would allow it to be commodified or distorted by those who didn't understand its essential nature. She had been wrong, Elena thought, or maybe just incomplete in her thinking. The corruption came from isolation, from wisdom that died with its keepers because they had been too afraid to trust the next generation. The debt was paid now, the farm financially stable in ways Margaret had never achieved, but Elena understood that her grandmother's struggles had been partly intentional. Staying small, staying marginal, had been protective coloring, a way to avoid attention while preserving something powerful. Elena's approach was necessarily different, accepting visibility as protection, using documentation and public engagement to make the farm too witnessed to disappear quietly. Both strategies had validity. Both carried risks. The land didn't judge, just continued teaching whoever showed up willing to learn. Marcus Chin had become an unexpected ally in ways that extended beyond jurisdictional holds and grant applications. He had quietly been working within county government to establish protections for heritage agricultural sites, creating legal frameworks that recognized traditional farming knowledge as cultural resource worth preserving. It was slow work, requiring patience and political maneuvering that often frustrated Elena, but Marcus persisted with the same steady determination he brought to everything. He had explained once, over coffee at the farmhouse kitchen table, that his own family had lost their farm 2 generations back to exactly the kind of corporate pressure and governmental indifference that threatened keeper sites. Helping Elena protect this place was his way of honoring what his grandparents hadn't been able to save. The workshop participants gathered in the barn as morning light streamed through windows that had been carefully positioned to illuminate the teaching space naturally. Elena stood before them, recognizing her own younger self in their faces, the combination of hope and skepticism that came from being told the land was degraded beyond saving and then discovering methods that suggested otherwise. She began the way she always did, not with technique but with relationship, asking them to share their stories, to name what had brought them to this mountain seeking knowledge their agricultural education had never mentioned. A man in his 50s from eastern Montana spoke about watching his family's wheat operation deteriorate over 3 decades despite following every recommendation from extension agents and chemical company representatives. His soil wouldn't hold moisture anymore, his yields declining each year even as his input costs increased. He was here, he said with quiet desperation, because continuing down the current path meant losing land his family had worked for 4 generations. A young woman from a small organic vegetable operation in Idaho described soil that tested well but produced disappointing crops, plants that grew but never thrived, yields that kept her farm barely profitable despite premium prices. She had tried everything conventional organic agriculture recommended, but something essential was missing from the relationship between her cultivation and the land's response. An older couple from Wyoming operated a small cattle ranch using rotational grazing and heritage breeds, methods that worked but which their neighbors dismissed as inefficient and old-fashioned. They weren't here to learn new techniques, they said, but to connect with others who understood that efficiency wasn't the only measure of agricultural success, that some values couldn't be quantified in yield per acre or profit margins. Elena listened to each story with the attention Margaret had taught her, recognizing that the real teaching began not with solutions but with validation, with confirming that these farmers' observations were legitimate even when conventional wisdom dismissed them. The land's behavior couldn't always be explained by chemistry and genetics. Sometimes it responded to factors that existing agricultural science didn't measure, patterns that traditional knowledge had recognized empirically even without understanding mechanisms. Over the following days, she guided them through the farm, teaching by demonstration and observation rather than lecture. They learned to read soil not just through chemical tests but through the behavior of indicator plants, the activity of visible soil life, the texture and scent that revealed biological health beyond mineral composition. They practiced seed selection using criteria that included vigor and adaptation rather than just yield potential. They studied the heritage cattle, learning to recognize traits that indicated animals capable of thriving through partnership with landscape rather than dependence on controlled conditions. James joined them in the orchards, describing how Margaret had selected rootstock and varieties not for commercial appeal but for resilience and flavor and the mysterious quality she had called harmonic fit, the way certain plants seemed to belong in certain soils, thriving where others of supposedly superior genetics struggled. He showed them pruning techniques that worked with the tree's natural growth patterns rather than forcing artificial forms, explaining that cultivation was conversation, each cut a question and the plant's response an answer that informed the next season's decisions. In the evenings, they gathered in the barn for sessions that felt part seminar, part storytelling, part confession. Elena shared documentation from the cellar, carefully selected materials that illustrated principles without revealing the full scope of what was preserved there. She showed them Margaret's journals, decades of observations about planting bilunar phases and soil mineral fluctuations and weather pattern correlations. She presented yield data and soil health measurements that confirmed traditional methods could match or exceed conventional agriculture's productivity while building rather than depleting the land's long-term fertility. But she also spoke honestly about the challenges, the political and economic pressures that made farming this way difficult in systems designed to reward industrial scale and chemical dependency. She told them about Morrison and the attempted seizure, about the ongoing vulnerability of knowledge that threatened corporate agricultural interests. She wanted them to understand that choosing these methods wasn't just adopting different techniques, it was joining a resistance against forces that wanted farming centralized, standardized, and controlled. The participants absorbed it all with the intensity of people discovering that their private struggles were part of larger patterns, that the difficulties they had experienced weren't personal failures but predictable consequences of agricultural systems designed around extraction rather than stewardship. They took notes and photographs, collected seeds and soil samples, formed connections with each other that would continue long after the workshop ended. Elena watched them transform over the course of the week, arriving defeated and leaving determined, returning to their own properties with tools both practical and philosophical for approaching their land differently. On the final evening, they held a gathering that had become tradition, a potluck featuring food grown using methods they had learned, a celebration of agricultural possibility that tasted like hope and heritage and stubborn persistence. James offered a blessing that acknowledged the keepers who had preserved this knowledge through generations of suppression and doubt, the farmers who had continued practicing traditional methods even when the world insisted they were backwards and inefficient. Elena felt Margaret's presence strongly then, imagined her grandmother standing at the edge of the gathering, satisfied finally that her life's work was being carried forward. After the participants departed the next morning, Elena walked the property in the way she had learned from Margaret, reading the land's condition through observation and attention. The soil held moisture better now after 3 years of building organic matter and supporting biological activity. The orchard showed the vigor that came from trees properly matched to their location. The cattle moved across pastures in patterns that distributed their impact beneficially rather than concentrating damage. Everything spoke of health that went beyond productivity, of systems functioning as partnerships rather than exploitations. She ended at the cellar, descended into the cool darkness that held jars of earth and seeds of persistence, sat in the chair where her grandmother had recorded decades of agricultural wisdom. Elena added her own observations to the continuing documentation, noting the week's workshop and the farmers who had come seeking different ways forward. She wrote about the evolution of keeper work, how preservation through sharing was proving more resilient than protection through secrecy, how visibility provided defense that isolation never could. The cellar would remain here, she thought, long after she was gone, holding knowledge for whoever came next with enough stubbornness to question agricultural certainty and enough humility to learn from soil. The farm would continue teaching its lessons to anyone willing to listen, demonstrating that the land's wisdom was older and deeper than industrial agriculture's brief dominance. And somewhere in the future, another farmer would stand where she stood now, inheriting legacy and responsibility, carrying forward the conversation between human cultivation and living earth that stretched back beyond memory and forward beyond sight. Elena climbed the stone steps into afternoon sunlight that painted the mountains gold and green, closed the cellar door with reverence that acknowledged everything it held. The farm spread before her in patterns of cultivation and wildness, human intention and natural response braiding together into landscape that was both made and given, worked and gifted. This was Margaret's true legacy, not the hidden archive but the living demonstration that agriculture could be practiced as partnership, that the land would teach anyone patient enough to listen, that wisdom preserved through generations remained relevant because good soil science was always good soil science, regardless of whether it wore the clothing of tradition or modernity. The wind carried the scent of growing things and mountain stone, of irrigation water running through channels cut by her great-grandfather and maintained by every generation since. Elena breathed it in, this air that had sustained keepers and farmers and stubborn mountain people who had refused to accept that the land was merely resource to be extracted. She thought about the farmers who had just left, returning to their own struggles with new tools and old wisdom, becoming part of the network that would preserve and transmit this knowledge forward. She thought about the land itself, patient and enduring, continuing to offer its lessons to whoever showed up ready to learn. The sun was setting now, painting the valley in colors that Margaret had loved, that Caroline had eulogized in her own journals, that Elena would carry in her memory when her own time came to return to the soil that had taught her everything. The farm would continue. The land would remember. And somewhere in the quiet conversation between cultivation and earth, between human intention and natural response, the work of keeping would go on, generation after generation, roots running deep into mountain soil that held the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever loved this ground enough to fight for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.